For 8 months, I watched my neighbor build a garage on my land without realizing it. I want you to sit with that for a second. 8 months. I could see the construction from my kitchen window. I heard the nail guns every morning. I walked to the back corner of my yard probably a dozen times and stood there looking at what was going up on the other side of the fence. And every single time, I talked myself out of what I was seeing. That's the part of this story I'm least proud of. Not what I did after I found out. What I didn't do while it was happening. His name was Dale Richter, 53 years old, retired from a commercial HVAC company he'd sold a few years back for what I gathered was a comfortable number. Big guy, always in cargo shorts regardless of the weather. The kind of man who had a strong opinion about everything and enough free time to share it. He'd been my neighbor for 6 years. We weren't friends exactly, but we were cordial. Guy waves from his driveway, you wave back. That kind of arrangement. For 8 months, while I was waving from my driveway, he was pouring concrete on my land. Let me back up to the beginning. I bought my house in Pflugerville in 2019. That's northeast of Austin, right off the 130 tollway, if you know the area. Quarter-acre lot, 3-bed, 2-bath, nothing that was going to make a magazine, but it was mine, and I'd worked for it. The neighborhood is one of those Texas subdivisions that went up fast in the early 2000s, identical roof lines, nice enough yards, the kind of street where everyone has a Ring doorbell and somebody's always pressure washing their driveway on a Saturday morning like it's a competitive sport. One of the specific things I liked about my lot when I bought it was the back left corner, southwest corner of the yard, if you're standing at the house looking out. It was a good-sized open space, slightly shaded by a live oak that had to be 30 years old. And, from the first week I moved in, I had this image in my head of what I was going to do with it eventually. Covered patio, cedar posts, maybe, string lights, a couple of Adirondack chairs, and a fire pit for the nights in October when the Texas heat finally breaks and the air actually feels like air again. I hadn't built it yet. Money, time, the usual, but I knew it was there waiting. And that was enough. Dale and his wife Karen moved in next door about 8 months after I did. They came over the first week with a Whataburger gift card, which in Texas is basically a gesture of genuine goodwill. And I thought we were going to be fine neighbors. Dale was loud in the way that some men with money and free time get loud. Not mean about it, just always on, always with something to say. He had opinions about the HOA's new trash bin rules, about the best brisket place in the area, about the right way to maintain a lawn in a Texas summer, about contractors, about local politics, about whatever had been on Fox News that morning. Karen was quieter. She gardened, kept to herself mostly, waved from the driveway. She had one of those smiles that was perfectly pleasant and revealed absolutely nothing about what she was actually thinking. I didn't know her well. I didn't know either of them well, really. The first sign of trouble came about 2 years in. Dale decided he wanted to replace the chain link fence along our shared property line with a cedar privacy fence. He mentioned it to me on a Saturday morning while I was getting the mail, the way you'd mention you were getting a haircut. Informational, not really a conversation. I said, "Hey Dale, you getting a survey done before you put that fence up?" He laughed. Not mean, just the laugh of a man who finds a question slightly ridiculous. He said it's just replacing the old fence, same line it's always been on. I said, yeah, but the old fence might not actually be on the property line. He said it's been there since 2003. It's on the line. I said, you sure about that? He looked at me for a second and then said, and I want you to remember this phrase because it's going to come back. He said these lot lines are basically guesses anyway. Nobody's gonna make a thing out of a fence. And I let it go. The fence went up and it looked fine, and I told myself I was being paranoid about nothing. But I filed that phrase away somewhere. These lot lines are basically guesses anyway. Set it in a drawer in the back of my head and didn't touch it for 3 more years. Dale had been talking about building a detached garage for as long as I'd known him. He had a truck, an SUV Karen drove, and a boat he took out to Lake Travis maybe 4 times a year, but talked about like it was a full-time lifestyle. He wanted covered storage. Fine. I had no issue with the concept. The first I heard about the actual project was a Saturday in February when Dale flagged me down from across the fence while I was doing yard work. Said, hey, starting that garage build I've been talking about. Just wanted to give you a heads up, neighbor to neighbor. I said, cool. Whereabouts on your lot? He gestured toward the back corner, the corner closest to mine. I said, you getting a survey done first. He smiled. Same smile as the fence conversation. Said his contractor had been doing this for 20 plus years, knew what he was doing. Said the original lot stakes were still visible from when the neighborhood was platted. Said he wasn't going to spend money on a survey for something this straightforward. I almost pushed harder. I could feel something pulling at me. Some instinct that said, ask again. But Dale was already moving on. Already talking about the contractor's timeline. Already treating the conversation like it was over, and I let it be over. Some decisions cost you nothing. Some cost you $100,000 worth of someone else's concrete. Construction started the following week. First, it was just clearing. A crew came out and scraped the back corner of Dale's lot, pulled up grass and a couple of shrubs that had never looked healthy. I could see it from my kitchen window, and it looked like it was on his side of the fence. So I poured my coffee and moved on with my morning. Then the concrete truck showed up. I want you to understand what a concrete truck at 7:15 in the morning does to a Tuesday. That particular low diesel rumble combined with the backup beeping is not something you sleep through. I was standing at my kitchen window at 7:18 watching them maneuver into position, and something in the back of my head started doing math I wasn't ready to finish. But the fence was there, and the fence was the line. That's what I told myself. 2 weeks later, the forms came out and I could see the foundation slab from my yard. I walked out to the back corner and stood at the fence and looked at it and tried to figure out from eyeballing it whether the concrete was on his side of the line or mine. I told myself it was his. I went back inside and made lunch and didn't think about it. 2 weeks after that, they started framing. Lumber delivery at 7 in the morning, nail guns from 7:30 until 5, the steady percussion of someone else's project filling up my weekends. I watched the walls going up from my backyard, and something about the angle bothered me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. The corner of the framing seemed to track along my fence line too closely, seemed to leave no gap between Dale's structure and my property. But I'm not a contractor, and I kept deciding I didn't know what I was looking at. I walked to that back corner probably 12 times over the next 6 months. Stood there with my coffee or my beer depending on the time of day and looked at what was going up and felt that thing tighten in my chest, and then went back inside and found something else to think about. There's a word for what I was doing. It's called avoidance, and I'm not proud of it. But the alternative was starting a conflict with the guy I had to live next to. And every time I got close to doing something about it, I found a reason not to. What finally broke the pattern was a cookout at my buddy Marcus's place in Cedar Park in September. Marcus is a real estate attorney, does mostly property and land use work in Austin, and he was telling a story about a client who'd had a garden shed built 3 feet over his property line and didn't find out for 5 years. He said you would not believe how common this is in Texas, especially the subdivisions from the early 2000s where the original plats weren't precise and people just assumed the fence is the property line. I said, how do you find out if there's an issue? He said, you get a boundary survey done. I said, what does that run? He said, $450, maybe $500. Why, you thinking about something? I said, I don't know, maybe. He looked at me for a second with that attorney expression, the one that means I'm already working out the scenario in my head, and said, call me after you get the survey. I called the surveyor Monday morning. Had a guy out that Thursday. He worked along my back and south property lines for about 2 hours, quiet and methodical, checking his equipment, making notes. I watched him from the kitchen window the way you watch weather radar when you already know it's bad. At one point, he stopped in the back left corner and stood there for a long time, checking something twice, then a third time. He made a note on his tablet and moved on. He knocked on my door when he was done and showed me the preliminary findings. Very calm, the professional calm of someone who has delivered this kind of information before. He said there's an encroachment on your southern rear corner. Concrete foundation, active construction. It extends 4.3 feet over your property line, for a length of approximately 31 feet. I said I need you to say that again. He said it again. 4.3 feet. 31 feet long. I did the math standing there in my doorway. 133 square feet of my property. The exact corner where the live oak was, where I'd always planned to put the patio, sitting under Dale Richter's half-built garage. I said, how confident are you in this finding? He said, extremely. The original plat markers were intact and clearly located. This isn't a borderline situation. He gave me his card and suggested I speak with a real estate attorney before taking any action. I said I already knew one. I went inside. I didn't call Marcus yet. I poured a glass of water and sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the back corner of my yard and sat with what I knew for about 20 minutes. Outside, I could see the upper portion of Dale's framing over the fence. The OSB sheathing they'd started putting up solid and committed and sitting 4.3 feet into my life. Then I went next door. I want to explain why I did this before calling Marcus. Part of it was that I still wanted to believe there was an explanation. Survey error, some paperwork I didn't know about, some version of events where this turned out to be resolvable in a driveway. And part of it, if I'm honest, was that I wanted to be the one to tell him. I wanted to be standing there when he found out I knew. Dale answered the door in cargo shorts and a golf shirt, Lone Star in hand, looking like a man who had not spent 1 second thinking about property lines. I said, hey Dale, I got a survey done on my property. Something moved across his face. Not much, just a small shift, the way a card player's expression changes when a card comes up that changes the math. He said, oh yeah? I said, yeah. Turns out your foundation extends 4 feet and 3 inches over my property line. He took a sip of his beer. Then he smiled. Slow, the kind of smile that's buying time. He said those surveys can be off, you know. Different surveyors, different results. I said he used the original plat markers. He was pretty definitive about it. Dale said, look, I've been here 6 years. My contractor's been doing this for over 20. I think one of us would have noticed if we were 4 feet into the wrong lot. I said the report is going to say otherwise. He shifted his weight, leaned against the door frame a little, said, listen, even if there's some minor discrepancy, and I'm not saying there is, we can work this out. Yeah, there is no way to go down again. Lastly, even if there's some minor discrepancy, and I'm not saying there is, we can work this out between neighbors. I can write you a check, we put something on paper, everybody moves on happy, okay? I said I haven't talked to my attorney yet. Something changed in his face then. Less card player, more something else. He said, come on, don't be that guy. We've been neighbors for 6 years. You're really going to make this into a whole legal situation over a few feet? I said I'll be in touch, Dale. I went home and called Marcus. Marcus listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a second and then said, okay, don't go back over there. Don't talk to him without me present. Come in tomorrow morning. $9 to park on Congress Avenue, worth every penny. We sat down with the preliminary survey findings and Marcus walked me through the landscape. In Texas, when someone builds on your land without your permission, your options are removal, easement negotiation, or litigation. Texas courts, Marcus told me, are historically unsympathetic to encroachers, particularly when the property owner has been given notice and refused to act. The complicating factor was what Dale had already spent. The foundation for a structure that size in the Austin market was probably $35,000 to $40,000. Add the framing, the sheathing, whatever materials were already on site, we were probably looking at $55,000 to $65,000 of work that was going to have to come down if I said so. Marcus said he's going to fight this. That kind of money makes people fight. I said let him. Marcus said he's also going to come back with an easement offer. It might be significant. What's your number? I thought about the live oak in that corner. I thought about the patio I'd been planning for 5 years. I thought about 8 months of nail guns at 7:15 in the morning. I thought about, don't be that guy. I said there's no number. I want it removed. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said, all right, let's send the letter. The formal legal notice went out to Dale and his contractor by certified mail that week. Polite the way legal documents are polite. Thoroughly, precisely, without warmth. It cited the survey findings, notified them of the encroachment, demanded an immediate halt to construction, and requested a meeting within 14 days to discuss remediation. Construction stopped the next day. Whatever the contractor told Dale when he got his copy of that letter, the nail guns went quiet by noon. I stood in my backyard that afternoon and listened to the silence where the framing noise used to be and felt something I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a situation finally becoming honest. Dale came to my door 2 days later. I watched him on the Ring camera. He stood there with the legal letter in one hand, his other hand balled at his side, jaw set. He was trying to look calm and not quite managing it. He knocked twice. I didn't answer. Marcus had been clear. He stood there for another minute, looking at the door like he was deciding something. Then he walked back to his house. About a week later, his contractor showed up. Not to work, just to walk the site and look at things. I watched him through the fence. He spent about 20 minutes back there, measuring things, checking things, making calls. At one point, he was on the phone and I could hear his tone, if not his words. Clipped, defensive, the sound of a man explaining to someone why something that was supposed to be simple is not simple. He left without doing any work. Dale's attorney contacted Marcus 11 days after the letter. Their position, Dale would pay for a permanent easement, keep the foundation where it was, document it properly, file it with the county. Their number was $5,000. Marcus called me and told me. I said no. A week later they came back. $15,000 for the easement. I said no. 10 days after that, $25,000, and they emphasized this was Dale's final offer. That going to court would be expensive and time-consuming for both parties. That a reasonable person would take the money and move on. Marcus asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about what a reasonable person would do. I thought about $25,000, which is not nothing. I thought about it for probably 30 seconds. Then I thought about Dale standing in his doorway with his Lone Star, saying these lot lines are basically guesses anyway. I thought about the 12 times I walked to that corner and talked myself out of what I was seeing. I thought about 7:15 in the morning and 4.3 feet and the live oak in the corner of my yard. I said no. Remove it or we file. Marcus communicated that we weren't interested in an easement at any price. We wanted the encroachment removed within 60 days. And we'd be filing in Travis County District Court if they didn't commit to that timeline in writing by the end of the week. 3 days of silence. Then Dale's attorney called Marcus back. Dale would agree to removal. He needed 90 days. Marcus said 60. 75, they said. Marcus said 60 days, and we file Monday. They took 60 days. Written agreement executed by both parties, filed with Travis County, penalty clause if he missed the deadline, legal fees paid by Dale, and full restoration of my yard to pre-encroachment condition at his expense. Dale signed it on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus sent me a copy. I printed it out and put it in a folder. The 2 months between the agreement and the demolition were their own particular kind of quiet. Dale's half-built garage sat there in both our backyards going nowhere. Exposed framing, OSB sheathing starting to weather, no crew coming to finish anything. The HOA sent Dale 2 violation notices about exposed construction materials and incomplete structures, which I know because Dale apparently mentioned it to the neighbor across the street, who mentioned it to me with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has decided this is not their business. Karen stopped waving. Not dramatically, no glares, no scenes. She just stopped making eye contact when we were both outside. One afternoon in October, I was getting my mail and she was pulling into her driveway and we were maybe 30 feet apart and she looked directly through me the way you look through glass. I went inside and made coffee and thought about what $100,000 of avoidable consequences does to a marriage's ambient temperature. I had one more encounter with Dale during those 2 months. He caught me outside on a Sunday morning when I was bringing the trash bins back from the curb. And he walked across the property line, not across the fence, around the end of it, which was notable. And he stood about 10 feet from me with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing that thing again. He said, "I want you to know, I think what you're doing is excessive." I said, "Okay." He said, "We're talking about 4 feet. 4 feet that nobody would have ever noticed or cared about if you hadn't gone looking for a problem." I said I didn't go looking. I got a survey done on my own property. He said, "You know what this is going to cost me?" I said I have some idea. He looked at me for a long moment, said, "You know, some people in your position would have just taken the money, would have been the reasonable neighbor. I would have done that." I said, "I know you would have." Something in that landed. I watched it land. He didn't say anything else. He walked back around the end of the fence and went inside. I stood there for a minute with my trash bin handles in my hands and I thought about what he'd said. Some people in your position would have just taken the money. I thought about it for the rest of that morning, if I'm honest. $25,000 is real money. The patio I wanted to build was going to cost maybe $8,000. The math of it was right there. But then I thought about the live oak in that corner. I thought about 30 years that tree had been growing in the exact spot Dale wanted to bury in concrete. I thought about looking at his garage from my kitchen window for the next 25 years of my life, knowing it was sitting on my land because I took the money and moved on. Some things aren't about the money. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November. Mini excavator, concrete saw, 2 guys with sledgehammers for the cleanup. I didn't watch from inside. I made a cup of coffee and I stood on my back porch and I watched. It took most of the day. The concrete saw was loud in a way that was different from the nail guns. Lower, more final. By 4 in the afternoon, the part of that foundation sitting on my property was gone. There was a raw cut edge where they'd made the separation, and a strip of my yard torn up from the equipment tracks. Dale didn't come outside once. The restoration crew came the following week, regraded the soil, laid new sod over the disturbed area, cleaned everything up properly. The corner of my yard looked like mine again. I stood there that evening after they left. The live oak was still there, 30 plus years of it, leaves going amber in the November light. I put my hand on the bark for a second. Still there, still mine. Final tally as Marcus estimated it, demolition, legal fees, yard restoration, and the total sunk cost of everything that had to come down. Somewhere between $85,000 and $100,000 for a garage he never got to finish. Because he didn't want to spend $450 on a survey. About 4 months after the demolition, a Realty Austin sign went up in front of Dale and Karen's house. It was there for 6 weeks and then it came down. I don't know if they couldn't find a buyer, or changed their minds, or something else happened. I didn't ask, but the sign going up told me something about what that year had cost them that I didn't need anyone to explain. We still live next to each other. Dale waves sometimes from his driveway. I wave back. I don't carry this around as a victory exactly. It's not a thing I take pleasure in on an ongoing basis. He made an arrogant mistake and he paid for it, and now we're just 2 people living next door to each other again, which is more or less where we started. I built the patio last spring, stamped concrete, cedar posts, the string lights I'd been picturing since 2019. There's a fire pit in the corner under the live oak, 2 Adirondack chairs, a small table for a drink. On October evenings, when the Texas heat finally breaks and the air does that thing it does, I sit out there and watch the fireflies come up from the grass. Last week, I was out there at dusk and I heard a nail gun somewhere, a couple streets over. Somebody building something, some Saturday project in the neighborhood. My shoulders went up automatically, that old reflex. And then I looked at the cedar posts above me, and the string lights not yet turned on, and the live oak doing its thing in the corner of my property, certified and documented and entirely mine, and I let my shoulders back down. Some sounds don't mean what they used to, and before I built any of it, I got a survey done. Cost me $450. Some things are just worth it. So guys, I'm glad you've listened to this far, and if you enjoyed this story, please support the channel with a like and subscribe. Also, check out my other interesting stories in the upcoming videos. See you later!